deal with a different type of services from the ones that we've studied so far. Just to remind you, we've been concentrated very much on the network-based services, either physical network or more than that, information network. We've investigated in detail the innovation processes and the characteristics of banks, insurance companies, and mobile communication services. And before the break, which is actually not very long because we have the next lecture on November 3rd, we're going to talk about the science-based and specialized technology service suppliers. If you remember the Soeter-Miozzo taxonomy, which was describing different types of services in terms of type of users, mode of innovation, appropriability mechanism, and so on and so forth, this particular type of services is probably the most innovative one, and it's also the closest one to the manufacturing sectors. Okay, so what we will do is try to understand what are KIBs, so knowledge-intensive business services, where is the knowledge intensity, which is embedded in this type of activity, how do this service innovate, and a very important issue that relates to this specific services is the spatial dimension. So we'll try to understand what's the role of this particular type of services in the innovation systems at the country and more than that at the regional level. Okay? So, specialized technology suppliers and science-based services, when we talk about this, we talk mostly about software companies and specialized business services. For these particular services, the main source of technology and innovation itself is the innovative activities that is carried out within those companies. Okay, so differently for what we've seen, for example, for insurance companies and for the banking sectors, here in-house research constitutes probably the most important source of knowledge. Not the only one, but the most important one. The main objective of this type of companies is to provide a customized output which is targeted to particular users or to particular group of users. And within this group, I think that probably the most important type of companies are consulting services. Okay? So we do not have just consulting services in KIBs, but they are the prototype, if you want, of a knowledge-intensive business sector. Okay? So think of consulting companies, try to think also about different type of KIBs, and we'll try to define them in terms of different characteristics. KIBs play a particular important role as innovators in this very broad sector. Okay? If you remember when I showed you some statistics about innovation in services, we were saying that innovation in services is not really carried out through traditional means, that very often service companies adopt different appropriation means in order to protect the results of their research activity. Well, for KIBs, patents are more important than for other type of service companies. Everything that we said about services holds also in the case of KIBs, but these companies have some features that make them particularly interesting to be investigated. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about KIBs? I told you that a very important part of the KIB sector is the consulting companies. But just to be clear, here you have the official NAICS code classification, which relates to KIBs. Okay? So you have one big group of KIBs, which is computer and related activities. So you have hardware consultancy, software consultancy, data processing, maintenance, and so on and so forth. Research and development falls into this category. And by definition, this is a very innovative sector. And there is a very broad group of sector, which is nominated as other business activities, where we have legal offices, accounting, bookkeeping, auditing activity, tax, consultancy. On the one hand, then we have architecture and engineering activity, which is, of course, quite different from the first category, if you think about that. Testing activity and technical analysis, advertising falls within KIBs, and other professional and business services. Okay, so for example, companies doing market analysis, different type of consulting companies that you might think of. So the first thing that we notice talking about KIBs is that the whole sector is extremely heterogeneous. Okay? So the literature has concentrated on the modes of innovation and on the characterization of these particular companies, but bear in mind throughout all the presentation that here we have Accenture on the one hand, and we have the small legal office in a little place on the other hand. Okay? So KIBS, yes, they are knowledge-intensive services, but research and development activities are, of course, very different from auditing or tax consultancy activities. Okay? So what actually innovation means in this sector is really related to the specific characterization of different companies. Now, what do you think are the main characteristics of these companies, of this sector? If you look at the list of different types of companies, okay, is there any common issue that you think it's important? Is there any common feature? Is there something you would like to comment about looking at this list, which is, again, broadly speaking, the KIBS sector as a whole? How would you characterize these companies? Think again of the taxonomy of Soete Miozzo. What about the users? What about the size of the firms? What about the innovation strategy, the trajectory of innovation? What do they do?
I think they provide very customized services.
Okay. So the type of users, if we think about that as not a specific type of users, it's more someone or companies that interact very much with the services. So we have customized services, much more than with the network-based services. Okay, then what else? Yes?
It requires a lot of information from the user because it's customized.
Okay, so I've just mentioned that the source of technology is actually in-house research, but if we think about the information that I might collect in order to develop different type of innovations, not only technology-based, that information comes mostly from the users. Okay? This is particularly true if we think of consulting companies, probably less true if we think of bookkeeping, auditing activities, advertising. Okay? Yes?
If I think to those kind of activities, I think to services provided through standardization of processes. So most all that on processes.
Okay. Let's say that there is a certain degree of standardization of routines or business model. Okay. Actually, you remember when we discussed the insurance company sector, I showed you the number of patents that those companies were taking in the specific category of business models. Okay? And also KIBS are particularly active in innovating by means of patents in the business models, in the procedures by which they developed customized services. So they apply specific business processes to the needs of specific group of users. Other comments? Well, yes?
The importance of the human resource people.
Okay, so again, let's think of the source of innovation and technology. Human capital is probably more important here than in network-based services. Actually, when we discussed about the mobile communication sector, we didn't mention at all the role of personnel, the role of human capital in developing innovation. We discussed a little bit the role of users, but you remember in mobile communication and in general also in banks and insurance, users have a more passive role. The idea is that companies can acquire information, okay, on users' behavior, but there is not such a feedback as we have in this type of companies from users to producers. Okay, so the services are much less customized and they're much less interactive as compared to this type of services. In network-based services, the asset, the core asset, was the network, the infrastructure, whether physical or virtual infrastructure. Here, the core asset is the information that comes from the users, the personnel, and the need to develop specific technologies in order to deal with different business models and procedures. Okay? What about the size of the firms? Okay. Michela said, well, I think of small firms. Okay. You think also of large firm? Actually, the size, yeah, no. You want to say, add something? The size of the firm here is not really homogeneous, okay? Again, think of Accenture, think of a legal office, think of an advertising company, think of a group of 4 designers that build up an activity, think of a research and development lab, okay, or an hardware consulting, okay? It might as well be just one person that sets up a service. So the size of the company depends very much, and we'll see this, on the type of activities that is carried out and on the type of innovation that we think of, okay? So Accenture is somehow carrying out innovation in a very different way from an engineer, from a research and development lab, from a consultant in hardware or software. Remember that we're not talking about manufacturing activities. So when we list hardware consultancy, software consultancy, these are all services, okay? No manufacturing activity is involved in this specific category of firms. So, different definitions of KIBs that actually puts emphasis on different characteristics. Services that involve economic activities intended to result in the creation, accumulation, or dissemination of knowledge. One thing that we haven't really mentioned here, by definition, we're talking about knowledge-intensive services, okay? So, of course, knowledge becomes the most important asset that they have. Second definition, of course, if we think of KIBs, we can think of very different features. Private companies or organizations who rely heavily on professional knowledge or expertise related to a specific technical discipline or technical functional domain to supply intermediate products. I draw your attention to this idea of intermediate products and services that are knowledge-based, okay? So professional knowledge, back again to what Francesca was saying about the importance of personal and human capital, that is used, is very specific to some discipline, and is used to produce intermediate products. We'll come back to that, but just to give you an idea, these companies tend to serve very much business users, okay? They are defined as knowledge-intensive business services, which means that they need business in a place in order to provide the service, okay? Now, if you think about this in terms of structural composition of an economy, KIBs, of course, are part of the service sector, okay? But they need a very strong manufacturing core in order to provide their services, okay? So very often you find KIBs not in areas where you have just a very service-based economy, but in area which is traditionally based upon manufacturing activities, for which these companies provide actually very interesting and very important services, okay? So we do not have a substitution, if you want, between service and manufacturing in this respect, okay? Third, again, a different definition, but here the focus is more on the customization. So enterprises whose primary value-added activities consist of the accumulation, creation, dissemination of knowledge for the purpose of developing a customized service or product solution to satisfy the client's needs, okay? So knowledge intensity, professional knowledge which is specific to some disciplines or technical fields in order to provide customized services. Okay, so these three are the pillars, if you want, of KIBs activities. Now, just to summarize, these companies are concerned with the provision of knowledge-intensive inputs to the business processes of other organizations. Okay? Back again to the size of the firms. Okay? These companies might provide services to the private sector, they might provide services to the public sector. Okay? And in this sense, of course, the size of the service provider might change according to the user that they target. Okay? So, professional knowledge. This is a very important point. If you look at the empirical evidence on the mode of innovation of service activities in this particular sector. And if you look at the composition in terms of capital and labor intensity, what you observe is that these companies that are very knowledge intensive are actually very labor intensive as well. So they use standardized procedures and routines that are based upon large technical systems, but in the end, the intensity of this sector is very much concentrated on labor, which is also a little bit surprising if you think of the innovative pattern of these particular companies, if you think that we tend to think of labor-intensive activities as something which is not particularly innovative, okay? Here, labor is important, but what kind of labor? Extremely qualified labor. Very high-skilled people are working in different type of KIBS activities, okay? Again, with different characterization according to what specific sector we are trying to investigate. They are primary sources of knowledge. So they not only use the knowledge that come from the user in order to develop innovation, to develop new services or product, but they actually innovate themselves much more than any other kind of sectors we might think of, okay? And the idea is that this knowledge is produced, for example, in a way of developing business models or procedures and is then applied to specific customers, okay? So these particular companies do rely upon information coming from customers, but they do develop in-house innovation. They have in-house research and development. They try to develop actual knowledge. And they are important sources of knowledge also for the manufacturing sector, okay? So this is probably the most important sector that we will investigate, that provides important links between the service economy and the manufacturing sector, okay? Again, remember that KIBS are important for innovation in services. They are actually responsible for a very large share of value added in services, but they cannot survive without the manufacturing activities, okay? Which is very different from other type of services, for example, personal services, but we'll come to this when we'll investigate that particular category of services. Companies in this sector are extremely competitive, okay? So indeed you have the coexistence of small and large companies, but competition in this sector is very strong, okay? And they tend to supply primarily to the business users, okay? Of course, if you think of the legal office, if you think of the auditing consulting companies, if you think of tax consultancy, even if you think of the computer-related activity, you might think that the users there are actually consumers, okay? If you need some consulting to, I don't know, repair your computer or something, you can go and ask for a service that comes from a KIBS. But in general, they tend to serve large business users, okay? So they really produce intermediate services in order to respond to specific users' needs, okay? And these users are large companies. They might be private, they might be public. They provide lots of information, okay, which is then processed within the KIBS company in order to generate value added, okay? So professional knowledge, they are primary source of knowledge also for other sectors in the economy, and they tend to serve mostly business users, and they are extremely competitive. Now, I've shown you a table with different types of KIBS activities, okay? And that is, of course, the statistical definition, if you want, of knowledge-intensive business services, the official classification. But actually, we can think of the KIBS sectors in a different way, okay? So we start from these three main sectors. We have computer and related activities, research and development, and what they call other business services, okay? Now, starting from here, we can distinguish between two very broad fields. The first is the so-called professional KIBS, okay? So traditional professional services. These are intensive users of new technologies, okay? And here we find mostly business and management services. We found legal and accounting services, market research, to a certain extent advertising, although advertising might belong also to the other category. The second group of KIBs is the so-called new technology-based KIBs, what is called usually technical KIBs or TKIBs. And these companies have developed an activity which is strongly related to ICT. Okay? So yes, KIBs tend to innovate very much, but at least from this classification, what is really an innovative group of KIBs is the new technology-based services, okay? So those are actually the ones who carry out in-house research and development. Research and development consulting fall actually into this group, okay? This distinction is made mostly to distinguish the big category of other business services, okay? Because there you have engineers and architects on the one hand that to a certain extent might be considered as technical KIBs, and on the other hand, again, you have legal and accounting companies, okay, which are not probably very innovative themselves. So, taking back again the classification, technical KIBs would be KIBs related to the first two categories, so computer and related activities and research and development. And within the other business activities, we might think of technical KIBs as the architecture and engineering activities and other technical services, almost by definition, and also about testing activity and technical analysis. Legal, accounting, bookkeeping, advertising, other professional business services all fall in the professional KIBs. Okay? Now, bear in mind this distinction because if we try to investigate the modes of innovation in different types of KIBs, okay, we have to think of those companies as technology producers and the professional KIBs, with the exception of architecture and testing activities, as technology users. Okay? So all of them are characterized by this. So all of them provide customized services. They use information from the users. They have somehow standardized forms of carrying out the businesses, but in terms of actual innovation type, they're very distinct. Okay? They all fall within the same big group, but bear in mind this distinction because we'll come back to this later on. Now, let's try to investigate knowledge intensity on the one hand, innovation on the other hand, and then the geographical dimension, if you want. The very early research on KIBs has focused very much on consulting companies. So consulting companies have always been of interest for lots of scholars because of their peculiar nature of activity. Okay? If you think about consulting companies and compare them with other type of KIBs, the idea is that they're really characterized by an information richness, by expertise. They interact very much with users, much more probably than any engineers or architect or legal consultant you might think of. Okay? And the idea is that these companies provide a very strategic information, and they're actually paid very much for that. Okay? So also in terms of competition in the sector, I've started saying that this sector is particularly competitive, that companies within this sector tend to compete very much for the users. Within the consulting companies, especially business consulting, competition is less severe in the sense that really the asset that they provide is the strategic information, and if you think about the market for consulting companies, the top 10 consulting companies actually make more than 50% of the market, okay, in terms of revenues, in terms of users that they serve, in terms of different projects, okay? If you look at the patents or at the innovative activities in this particular category, remember as much as we saw in the insurance companies, consulting companies, business consulting companies are those that are actually patenting also in that activity, okay? Now, to what extent the information is strategic is, of course, debatable because lots of people think that, well, this is a sector where actually users have a very active role. So why shall I pay for something which is based upon the information that I provide to the company? Okay? If you go back to the very first lecture relating to innovation in services, one thing that we were mentioning is that since the product, the outcome is intangible, okay, one of the difficulties also to understand who should pay, when, okay, in which way, how should, for example, the value added be shared between users and producers, okay? With consulting companies, this is particularly true. The output is really intangible. What do they do? What do consulting companies do? Besides,
They provide solutions for some problem.
they provide solutions for some problem, okay, which might be, for example, what?
How to motivate workers maybe or something like that.
Okay, how to motivate workers, or?
How to implement a new ICT in order to...
Okay, so, yes, or how to reorganize, for example, a company. Then, of course, you have, I mean, you can perceive the outcome of consulting companies' activities. You have actually the perception that, I don't know, workers, for example, are more motivated, or that a company has been restructured. But evaluating how much this is due to the intervention of the consulting company and how much this is due to the actual intervention of the user is a very difficult task. Okay? But again, if you think about that, also in relative terms, consulting companies are the ones who are pricing their services probably most highly than anyone else. Okay? Surely in the KIBS activity. In 1999, Antonelli started discussing the role of KIBS, and he said that KIBS actually contribute very much to increase the overall level of labor productivity. So it is true that in a way they provide a really intangible type of service, much more again than banking. At least you can come out of a bank with a current account, or you can have different cards and everything, okay? Here in consulting, very often you have lots of manual, lots of books, or whatever about the business process, but what actually they contribute to is the increase in the labor productivity. So they are very labor intensive, but they also increase labor productivity in other sectors, okay? How to motivate workers, for example? Well, this is a way to increase labor productivity. So if I want a very active and a very productive labor force, I might ask Accenture to implement some kind of strategic plan in order to improve the quality of the personnel. If I want to restructure a company, well, very often this is due for cost efficiency matters and has to do with labor productivity, okay? So their role is not just to provide strategic information, but they have an important role in the overall economy, which has to do with the increase in the labor productivity, okay? They actually are an interface between the tacit knowledge which is embedded in the users, okay, and the knowledge based in the economy. Now, there are lots of jokes, and I really like the consulting sector because it's an interesting part of the economy, but you know that there are jokes about consulting asking you all the information and then returning to you the information just put in a different way, right? But the real value added of this company is that they turn the tacit knowledge into codification, okay? So they have a very important role because also in the face of the company they serve, they can translate the tacit knowledge in order to make it available to all the people in a company, for example, in order to make it work for the knowledge-based economy, in order to increase the profitability of the company, which is based upon that specific knowledge. Okay, so again, not to, let's say, motivate too much the use of the consulting companies, but that strategic information is important in terms of labor productivity, which is something that increases also the growth of the economy. It's very important because somehow it turns tacit knowledge into codified procedures. Okay, Sebastiano was talking about the standardization of routines, the standardization of business models, if you want. Indeed, what they do is they try to extract the knowledge from the customers and then implement it within a codified, okay, way. And this is, of course, important in order for this knowledge to be diffused. And again, if we believe that knowledge diffusion is something which is good for the economy, then these companies and this type of services have a very important role. Now, of course, again, think of a consulting company. Where is the knowledge lying? Well, the knowledge is intrinsically linked in the knowledge of their employees. Okay, so lots of students that are coming out of Bocconi University, for example, go and work for a consulting company. Why is that? Because they pay a lot. No. No, it's not just that. Why is that? Well, because allegedly, if you've studied, I don't know, undergrads and the master degree, you are highly qualified. These companies are looking for extremely high-skilled employees. Okay? Now, if you think of the distinction between technical KIBs and professional KIBs, if you think of, for example, hardware consulting companies or software consulting companies, probably the level of skills does not need to be as high as, for example, in business consulting. Okay? You do not really need to translate tacit knowledge into codified knowledge. Okay? After all, if you're a hardware consulting service, all you do is transfer a knowledge which is already codified into a service for the user. But here, you really need smart people. You need people who are actually knowledge intensive themselves in order to translate tacit knowledge into codified knowledge. Okay? And for this reason, KIBs are important because they stimulate the diffusion of knowledge within different innovation systems. Okay? They interact with customers. They try to co-produce, if you want, knowledge-based services by way of developing also customized services. And in this way, they contribute substantially to the value add in the economy. So if you remember, when we started talking about the service sectors, we said that more or less 70% of the economy, with some distinction, is due to the service activities, where KIBs actually contribute to a large extent. Okay? So together with financial services and insurance companies, KIBs are probably the most productive one in terms of contributing to the knowledge-based economy. Therefore, they are facilitators, carriers, and sources of innovation. Okay? Now, look at this and think back again at the technical versus professional KIBs. Okay? So think of the hardware consulting type of services and think of the business models or think of other type of professional services. How do you think they carry out innovation? What are the most important traits of innovation in these companies? If asked, how do you innovate, what do you think they respond? What is the type of innovation which characterizes this sector? Processes. What do you mean by process innovation?
Like way to do things.
Okay, so it's slightly different from the manufacturing process innovation idea. So not very much to reach a very very high cost efficiencies, but to somehow standardize codified knowledge. Okay? Think back at the different types of innovation that were described by Galush and Weinstein. They do lots of formalization innovation. Okay, so if we think, again, the classification of innovations, what we found very often in this type of companies is innovations that have to do with processes, that have to do with the codification of a knowledge which is tacit, and this means that they formalize, in a way, their business process. Remember that formalization is a way of transforming something which is intangible in something which is more tangible, okay? So in codifying the knowledge, they also move from services that are very intangible to services that are tangible and upon which they can, of course, charge a price, okay? So formalization of innovation is a way of turning intangible outputs into, let's say, more tangible outputs, not very tangible outputs. What else? How do they innovate? Do not think just of Accenture, okay? Think broadly about consulting, about knowledge-intensive business services. What is a lawyer doing, which represent a business-intensive, knowledge-intensive business service? Do they innovate at all? First of all, because we are assuming somehow that these companies are extremely innovative. Okay, well, try to understand if this is the case, but think of an advertising company, think of a research and development lab. Okay, Michela said we have lots of process innovation, formalization innovation. What else? Yes.
I think maybe some incremental innovation, because like lawyers or advertising companies, but also R&D labs, they basically build new knowledge on knowledge that they have.
Okay.
So they can offer services that are increasingly, like they increase the quality of the services every time.
Okay. Let's focus on the quality of services, which is something I like more than incremental innovation. Yes?
In line with this intervention, also the fact that the innovations are emergent, maybe in the sense that if they are not pushed by the companies from the outside, there is a demand that asks something, therefore they innovate in one specific case, and then they try to extend this kind of innovation also to other.
Okay, so they start from providing customized services, which are then standardized in the way that also Michela was saying, so there is a sort of formalization. What are designers doing? Again, a type of knowledge-intensive business service, at least from the classification that we've seen, probably a very peculiar type. What do they do? What is their activity? You go in a design studio or in a design office, what do you see? If you see something.
Architectural innovation, maybe.
Okay, architectural innovation. They're probably also the closest one to the manufacturing sectors. Okay, so in a way they're classified as knowledge-intensive business services, but they very often produce also a tangible output. Okay, so the degree, the extent to which the output of different knowledge-intensive business services is intangible depends very much on the type of activities. Okay, so you might also have product innovation in the strict sense. Okay, whenever we think, for example, of designers developing specific services for different groups of users. Okay, all the area of communication design, for example, is an area in which you have actually a tangible output. Okay, an output which is more tangible than, for example, what happens if we think of consulting companies. Some numbers. Now, this table is based upon a survey on European countries. Product and process innovation, product or process innovation, product and process. These are the numbers. Look at KIBS. Okay. Now, KIBS actually develop more innovation than other type of services. This is not surprising. If we look at the share of product innovation and process innovation, what we see is that, of course, this is the claim of the company, having to decide whether they carry out product or process innovation, they tend to respond that they're focusing very much on product innovation. Now, of course, the survey is done both for the manufacturing and for the service companies, so they have to find ways to provide the same type of information. Product innovation here has to do more with what we think of service innovation, and this has to do more with the cost efficiency part of the innovation. Okay? These are among all novel products and process innovation, and again, KIBs are particularly innovative as compared to other types of companies. Not only product and process innovation are important, but again, thinking of a very broad definition of innovation as we saw starting from Schumpeter and then also in the vision of Galuge and Weinstein, we have organizational innovation, which is also very important, marketing innovation, okay? Lots of companies are actually specialized in this type of innovation. And if we look again at the type of enterprises with innovation activities, there is a very high percentage of companies that declare to carry out innovation activities in KIBs as compared to other type of services, okay? So they seem to be actually a very innovative type of companies. The extent to which they develop product, process, organizational, or marketing innovation has to do with the nature of their activities, okay? And now we try to understand what kind of factors determine the competitiveness of KIBs as compared to other type of services and the modes of innovation in KIBs. So, in general, KIBs tend to be more innovation-oriented as compared to firms in all service sectors taken as a whole, okay? So if you remember when we compared services and manufacturing at the very beginning, we provide some empirical evidence stating, of course, that manufacturing companies are overall more innovative than service companies, but with the exception of KIBs. So KIBs are actually represent an exception in the overall service environment. They tend to spend significantly more on innovation. So it's not just a matter of, you know, developing architectural innovation, trying to recombine existing service characteristics. Here we are talking really about innovation expenditures, okay? And if you think about R&D labs as part of the KIB sector, well, they actually do that as their core activities, okay? However, there are very important differences across different types of KIBs in terms of R&D intensity, on the one hand, pure R&D intensity, and in terms of modes of innovation. So overall, KIBs tend to develop very much organizational innovation, marketing innovation, besides products and process. But of course, the type of innovation and the strategic factor that allow companies to carry out innovation vary very much according to technical and professional KIBs, okay? Also, within the technical professional KIBs distinction, we can also think of different modes of innovation, okay? Because, for example, if you compare an R&D lab with an engineer and with an hardware consulting company, they're all technical KIBs. They base their innovation activities very much on technology, on hard technology, okay? But clearly, the outcome of their innovation process is extremely different, okay? And they're all technical KIBs. So beside the traditional sectoral classification, even looking at this particular classification is not enough. So we need to understand what's lying behind the idea that we have some KIBs that are new technology based, some KIBs that are more traditional in the way in which they carry out innovation, in the way in which they develop the activity. A very important point on which we will come back when discussing the spatial dimension of the KIBs activity is that there seems to be a very high correlation between internationalization of activities and innovation. What do you think is the relevant market for KIBs company? I mean, besides having read this here, do you think this is plausible? Do you think this is an overstatement or it has some foundations? So KIBs that are extremely internationalized are also very innovative. Think of everything that we said so far, okay? Would you agree with this? Well, this is empirical evidence, of course, but you know that also empirical evidence needs to be treated with caution somehow. Would you have expected this? Yes or no? So very internationalized.
Yes, in a certain way, as if we say that from a certain point of view, innovation comes from customers,
Yeah.
or is customer based, or it's we say that it's process and we try to standardize. And so the more people we have involved and the more different ideas we can touch, the more innovative it will be.
Okay, so you look at the, let's say, internationalization of companies as a way of looking at the market size. Okay, you remember last time we were discussing the role of users in terms of providing incentives and providing information.
More even than market size, diversity in the market size.
Okay. Yes.
Let's say I'm a legal office providing legal services. Perhaps I'm in the USA, I have a huge market, but the structure is always the same. So at the end, I'm not pushed or forced to innovate.
Okay.
Well, if I cover different legal systems or I don't know, whatever, but I see variety, I guess it will help to innovate.
Okay. Other comments? Rita, you had a comment?
It was in line with his comment linked with the heterogeneity and the fact that it provides more opportunity to innovate. And maybe also the fact that if you have a wider customer base, you have more access to resources, and the resources are crucial in the sense that for innovation you need also R&D and expenses.
Okay. What do you think is a typical market of a KIBS company as compared, for example, to a big insurance company? Where do these companies go and look for customers? Because, of course, there are a bunch of KIBS that are highly internationalized. Okay? But on average, if you think of professional KIBS or even technical KIBS to a certain extent, yeah.
Very close sort of proximity to their offices. Usually do some
They tend to actually look at the proximity of customers. Okay, most of these companies have an activity that is spread around, let's say, a region or maybe a country. Okay, so the percentage of companies that are actually internationalized in the sense that you were mentioning is very low. Okay, in this way, we have to qualify with the statement, because the idea is that, of course, if you are very internationalized, you have tend to have a very big market size, heterogeneity of customers, which allow you to develop customized services to different categories of customers, and you have access to resources, okay, even to professional knowledge, so to the personnel that you want to employ in your company. On the other hand, by definition, this activity needs very close contact to the customers, okay? For some activities more than for others. And this means that if you look for customers that are really far away, or if you go and open up a business in a market which is very far from, even in a cultural way, from your own market, chances are not very good that you become successful unless you're a very large company, okay? Now, starting from this idea, we have performed an analysis focused on the case of Lombardy, okay, which is a very interesting case because Lombardy has a very high share of manufacturing activity. So even within Italy, this is a very sort of a region which is very much developed in terms of manufacturing activities, much more than in terms of services, okay? And again, the link between KIBS and manufacturing sectors is extremely important. Now, we've tried to investigate on a sample of different KIBS companies in this region, what are the factors for competitiveness and what are the modes of innovation, okay? Factors for competitiveness. Now, again, survey-based. So these are thousands of companies. Very important, rather important, not very important, not important at all. Okay? So you go from 1 to 4, where 4 is not important. These are the most important factors for competitiveness that we've found in these particular sectors. So first of all, quality of service. Okay? This is the most important factor. Reputation of companies. Again, think back of you as a user of a business service as compared to you as a user of a mobile communication operator or as a user of a bank. Okay? The speed of service delivery, the use of advanced technology, the large range of services, which has to do also with the possibility of targeting a very heterogeneous customer base. Price competition, not very relevant in this particular sector. Okay. Surprisingly, collaboration with other firms is not particularly relevant. Availability of distribution channels, which is something that in services is of course very important. Again, think of the network-based services, not very relevant for KIBS. Okay? The location of distribution channel is also not particularly relevant. So we have a very interesting case in which quality of service, reputation of companies, the use of advanced technologies are the most important factors for competitiveness, and other factors that we've focused very much upon when we discussed other type of services, for example, the network-based services, are not important at all. Okay, so having a distribution, having a great availability of distribution channels is not a factor that is perceived as very important. Yes?
So location of distribution channel, okay, but location of the center of knowledge center, I don't know how to say it. The location of the office, let's say.
Okay.
You say that it's very territorial.
Yeah, I mean, that has to do with the reputation of companies in a way, and in terms of location of their activity, it doesn't seem to be extremely important. Okay, what is more important is having close contacts with customers, which means having your activity developed within a relatively small area. Okay, but not the precise location of distribution channels, which is slightly different. So the idea is it's important for me to be in an area where I can easily reach different type of customers, of course, according to the type of activity. Okay, not very much of being in Milan as compared to being, I don't know, in the province. Okay, and I think that this is a very important point also in relation to the fact that the activity of this type of companies tend to be extremely localized. Okay, so it doesn't really matter where I am as long as I can be in close contact with my customers. Okay, bearing in mind that in any case, if my activities is extremely internationalized, then I have more possibilities to carry out innovation because I'm in touch with different type of customers. Okay, but here really quality of service, reputation, and the range of service offered together with the use of advanced technology play a more important role than the rest. And of course, a more important role than price competition. Okay? So even if some of these services might be considered as standardized, still price competition is not an issue. Okay? Even in consulting companies that use standardized procedures, standardized business model, you do not really compete on price. Okay? This is quite straightforward. What about innovation? What about the types of innovation? Again, we've asked different types of companies, how do you innovate? Okay? Trying to provide them with a series of alternatives that might capture different types of process innovation, formalization innovation, architecture innovation, and so on and so forth. Again, you might see interesting results. For example, cooperation with customers does not seem to be a very important source of innovation. Okay? Use of ICT technologies for service production and for service delivery have a more important role for these companies. Okay? And this is, again, a bit surprising if we think of the way in which the literature has always discussed about the role of KIBS. Of course, you have to see this also a little bit in relative terms, but the idea is that these companies perceive the technology as being extremely important in order to innovate. So much more than other companies, they are really technology-based, and actually the difference is not meaningful if we distinguish between professional KIBS and technical KIBS. So this is something that is common to all type of different KIBS companies. Okay? Starting from this, so starting from the observation of different type of innovation modes, if you want, in different companies, we try to investigate a little bit more in detail the types of service activities. Because, of course, that is a very broad and general picture, but what about if we try to reduce a little bit the factors, okay? And we come out, actually, with a very interesting description of the KIBS activity in terms of innovation, because, as you can see, there are some companies, these are the results of a factor analysis on the variables that were described before, okay? So some companies actually put lots of emphasis on the adoption of technology as a way of innovation. Some companies put more emphasis on human capital competencies and the organizational structure, so the way in which they build and restructure the organization. Then there is a group of companies that actually think that the most important forms of innovation is the provision of new services, of different type of service activities. And there is indeed some firms that cooperate with the users and with other firms in order to develop innovation and give importance to the service distribution. So even if the big pictures tell us, look, technology seems to be the most crucial source of innovation for this type of companies, if you go and look a little bit more in detail, what you see is that there are different types of patterns of innovation within the KIBS activities, okay? Now, this type of innovation, if you think of, might be associated with professional and technical KIBS. So you might think that, you know, professional KIBS tend to perform innovative activities that are more related to organizational change, maybe to the external cooperation, while technical KIBS are naturally inclined to innovate by way of technology adoption and probably by way of producing new services. This is actually not really true because sectoral differences do not seem to hold very much. So the idea is that these modes of innovation cuts across different types of service activities. Okay? Again, always thinking that heterogeneity plays a much more important role as compared to the standard classification of KIBS activities. Okay? And we also clustered this variable, and we found out, this is on a subsample, 4 clusters. Okay? So some companies have a so-called interactive innovation mode, which means that they put lots of emphasis on the external cooperation. Some companies have what we call the product innovation mode. There are companies that do not innovate at all, and companies that combine the technology adoption innovation mode with the organizational change. Okay? And it is interesting to understand what are the determinants of these different innovation modes. Okay? In terms of firm size, for example, in terms of sector, in terms of type of users, in terms of location of companies and of users. So what do you expect? What do you expect, well, besides the conservative, let's say, innovation mode, what do you expect firms in this group look like? Are they big? Are they small? So take the interactive innovation mode as compared, for example, to this, which is the allegedly most innovative group of KIBS company. Okay? Do you expect any differences in terms of size of the companies, in terms of customer base, in terms of location of the activity? Where are large firms? So you expect large firms to be mostly here. So let's say okay. What about the location of companies? The degree of internationalization and the degree of performance of a very local activity, or the customer based?
Maybe custom creating
this cluster here. I mean, they do not innovate very much, so cluster 3, not very close to the customers, which might mean also that their activity is spread around the country or around the specific region with no particular emphasis on specific location. Yes?
I guess that as external cooperation implies trust, there will be leveraging on close players, outsourcing perhaps,
Okay.
from their core business and letting do everything else to people in their neighborhoods.
Okay, so cluster 1, in a way, close to the market, let's put it like this, which might mean
Small.
and small. Then I will show you some results. Okay, what about, beside the fact that there is not a clear-cut distinction between technical and professional KIBs, where do you think you find more technical KIBs? Think again about the distinction that we've emphasized before. Where are technical KIBs? Where do you find the highest percentage of technical KIBs as compared to professional KIBs? Where would you guess? So this was also one of our guesses. So here you have technical KIBs, right? So cluster 4, large firms, and again, in relative terms, of course, technical KIBs. Now let's see some results. Well, first of all, there is not any significant sectoral difference between professional KIBs and technical KIBs, but if we look at the sheer percentage without having the ambition of finding a statistically significant difference, cluster 1, which is the interactive innovation mode, has more technical KIBs than professional KIBs. Okay, probably you would have guessed the opposite. And in a way, this has to do with the role of architecture and engineering activities. So technical KIBs, of course, are hardware and software consulting companies. They are R&D development activities, but we also have some business activities that falls into that group of professional KIBs. Okay? And in this respect, we might think that architecture and engineering services have a higher degree of interactivity as compared to pure technical KIBs. Even more interesting, if we go and look at the detailed sectoral composition, cluster 3, which is the not very innovative mode of innovation, and I will say not very close to the market, includes KIBs that are related in relative terms more to computing activities. Okay? So computing activities in KIBs tend to be very standardized, tend to be not particularly innovative if you think of someone who repairs a computer or just carries out some data processing activities. Okay? Call center would be in the KIBs, but knowledge intensity, of course, is a very different issue. So interactive innovation mode tends to be more professional KIBs intensive than technical KIBs intensive. Those who do not innovate very much tend to be related to computing activities. Firm in cluster 4s, where is Michaela, tend to be small. Okay, so we have, we also expected to have large firms here. So it's interesting when you actually go and analyze the empirical evidence because you might find different results from what you expected. They tend to be small, they tend to be very flexible firms, and firms in cluster 1 tend to be relatively larger and relatively older than firms in our cluster. Why are you laughing, Sebastiano? Yeah, but, okay. Why do you think that firms in cluster 1 tend to be older and larger?
Because to build a reputation, you have to be in the market
because this is a sector where you interact very much with customers and users. It's a group of firms, not a sector, where you interact very much with customers and other firms in order to innovate. And for that interaction to take place, you need reputation, exactly for that reason. And so in this sense, this is a very interesting type of innovation mode because you have large and relatively old firms that somehow manage to provide forms of innovation by way of interacting with other companies in the market. In general, there is not a big difference in the way in which firms perceive the market. So the market is perceived as being extremely local, especially for firm in cluster 1. So this is actually correct. Again, the idea that these firms tend to interact very much with users and with other firms in order to provide innovative services has to do with the fact that these firms are extremely localized. Okay? And more than this, the customers type of firms tend to be very small and medium enterprises. This is particularly true for firms in cluster 4, but this has to do also with the size of the firm. So, of course, there is somehow a correlation between the size of the service provider and the average size of the user which is served by those service providers. More results. We asked also companies about the perception of their competitors. This is something that we haven't discussed in detail. Okay? So competitors, again, tend to be local. Okay? As much as the market is local, also competitors are perceived as being local companies. So a small computing consulting company does not perceive IBM as being their most important competitor. Okay? But there are great differences related to the determinants of competitiveness. So think back of the factor of competitiveness. Okay? We have quality of service, reputation, price, and different type of competitiveness. What we do observe in terms of our cluster? Well, first of all, in general, the more innovative patterns or modes imply more focus on distribution process and post-sale services. Okay, so for these firms, these two factors for competitiveness appear to be extremely important. The most innovative cluster, which is indeed composed by small firms and not by large firms, consider innovativeness, the speed of delivery, the range of service offered as being important factors for competitive advantage. And interestingly enough, reputation is negatively related with the participation of firms to cluster 1. So the interactive mode, Valentina is looking. So the interactive mode, which in our minds relates very much to reputation of companies, here takes place much more in terms of interactivity with the local market instead of through the wide market visibility. Now, when you ask companies about the role of reputation, okay, you always need to be careful because, of course, when you think of reputation, you might think of I'm well known within Europe or I'm well known within my group of customers. Okay? So this result is a bit peculiar again, and I think it has to do very much with the definition of reputation that you might think of when you respond to such a question. But still, what we see is that reputation matters more from other firms than for this in terms of competitiveness. Okay? Again, they probably have a high reputation, but how much is reputation important for the competitiveness? Okay, since they are all quite well known in the market, probably that is not the crucial variable. So we can also read this result in this respect. And very interesting also, KIBs do not really hire new personnel very frequently, but what they do very much, they train existing resources. So they think of the knowledge of their personnel and of the value added that comes from the human resources very much, but what they do is try to invest in their existing resources much more than building up new resources or trying to hire new profiles. Okay? And again, this has to do with the specific activities and with the closeness to the customers that these companies have as compared to other type of companies. The last piece of evidence that we discussed has to do with the spatial dimension of KIBs. Now, together with the idea that KIBs are knowledge intensive and are extremely innovative, okay, comes the idea that the activity of knowledge intensive business services has to be very close to the market. So besides the fact that empirically we observe different modes of innovation, the idea is that KIBs needs to be in close contact with customers, and therefore they are a crucial element of growth and innovation, especially in local context. Okay? You might think of regions, for example. Now, this is, if you think, a little bit in contrast with the idea that as these companies are knowledge intensive, they might participate to the knowledge-based economy, which is increasingly global in a way. Okay? So companies that account for most of the value added in the service sector and accounts also for a big part of the employment in the service sector and that are knowledge intensive by definition have a very well-defined territorial dimension. Okay? And on the one hand, this has to do with the role of proximity with customers and suppliers. So all we've said so far means that as the output tends to be intangible, unless in some peculiar case, I need really to interact with my customers in order to make them understand the value of the output and to make them pay for that. Okay? And on the other hand, we have this idea that users interact very much with producers so that there is a co-production. Okay? Now, for co-production to take place, really users and producers need to be close to each other. So the idea is that the proximity with customers and with suppliers is a very important factor for the competitiveness of these particular services as compared always to other types of activity. The second issue that somehow justifies the idea that even in a global economy, these knowledge-intensive activities tend to be local has to do with the agglomeration economies, which is something that Rita mentioned a little bit before when she was talking about the access to resources. Now, she thought about that in a global terms, okay? But if you think of the traditional agglomeration economy at the urban level, what we observe is that it's metropolitan areas that provide a very large and diversified markets and qualified personnel. Okay? So given the fact that the activity in itself needs to be local in a way because the output is intangible and because it is very often co-produced between users and producers, where are these KIBs more naturally found? In urban areas, okay? In metropolitan areas, in big city region, if you want. This means that KIBs have a very important role for the competitiveness of regional systems in the sense that they support regional adaptability and responsiveness, and they can adapt very generic knowledge to specific needs of customers that are located in the region. So one thing that we found also in our empirical evidence was that probably the most common trait of all these activities was the perception of markets as being local, the perception of competitors as being local. So everything is concentrating in well-defined, if you want, geographical areas. Of course, there are exceptions, okay? But here we're giving a very broad picture of the KIBs activity. Again, on the spatial dimension and on the propensity to concentrate in metropolitan areas. Why do you think that these activities concentrate in metropolitan areas? So we've understood that they are local, okay, but why they concentrate more in London than, I don't know, in a small city in the north of England? Yes?
Because a metropolitan area is naturally heterogeneous.
Okay. Okay, so there is heterogeneity.
If a
Okay, so it has to do also with the size, of course, of the area. What else?
Proximity to their clients.
Sorry?
Proximity to their clients.
Okay, okay, so let's focus on the clients. Okay, because I could argue also that if you go in, I don't know, Leeds, or if you go in a smaller city in the north of England, you might be very close to customers as well. So try to qualify a little bit what you've said. You said that in metropolitan areas, you can be more close to your customers.
Metropolitan areas tend to have the client's headquarters as well. So business meetings and everything.
So if we think about the specific users of these companies that tend to be business, okay, large businesses, what you find is that very often the headquarters of large businesses is in metropolitan areas. So it is not just the opportunity of being close to them, but it's the opportunity of finding lots of users that you need in these particular areas. Okay, yes?
And I guess that the supply of knowledge comes more in metropolitan areas than...
Okay, and at the same time, the suppliers. Okay, now who are the suppliers of these companies? Because the users, we've discussed this in large extent. But what about the suppliers? Who are the typical suppliers of these companies?
Universities,
Okay.
specialized schools.
Okay, so you're thinking about human capital suppliers in a way.
I would also say the users themselves.
Okay, so the users in a way co-produce the service together with the company. So we go back to the idea that in metropolitan areas, the composition of the economy is characterized by specific users, which is those that I need, and by specific personal suppliers, which are those that I need. Okay, so presence of big customers, and this is why consulting companies, for example, tend to localize more than anyone else in metropolitan areas. There is a whole process of clustering, of course, which provides important feedback to the KIBs. And also, new firms, spin-offs of new firms tend to be concentrated at the local level in metropolitan areas. Okay? The greatest benefits of knowledge intensity, therefore, comes in major city region. Okay? So, if we think of KIBs as being particularly important for the development of regional innovation system, much more than for the development of the overall economy, well, major city regions tend to have a very important share of KIBs. Now, I'm just skipping to one. Let me see. This one. Okay, so that we conclude with this. Okay, this is the share of employment in KIBs between and within country. Okay, these are data that are available at 2006, and it's the EU 15. Now, the idea is that the share is on that axis. Okay, so here you have all the different countries. Within the countries, you have different regions, okay, and the top region is the one in which the share of KIBs is the highest. The bottom region is the one in which the share of KIBs within that region, within that country, is the lower. Yeah?
What does the purple square mean? Sorry.
These are the just top and bottom, and this is the mean. Okay, this is the mean of the U15. This is the mean share of employment in different countries, and then you have the top and the bottom region. Now, what we do observe, it's not very easy to read, but well, this is inner London, okay? Not surprising. Well, it is a bit surprising in absolute terms. Okay, in relative terms, we could have expected that, but absolute terms, okay, remember that KIBs do not include financial services. So inner London is actually quite striking. Of course, you have Brussels here, Madrid, Ile-de-France, which means Paris. If we look at Italy, well, the most densely populated region is Lazio, which is a capital city region. So the idea is that KIBs tend to be particularly concentrated in capital city region, much more than in Lombardy, for example. Okay?
Expected Milano, Lombardy.
Yes, but whatever we see in terms of metropolitan areas is even more striking if we think of capital city region. Because of course there you have lots of public administration offices that very often are users of this type of services. Okay, again, think of hardware consulting services, think of legal and auditing offices, because again, this is KIBS, this is a very broad picture. You want to say something? No.
It was exactly the point on public administration.
Yeah. So this is well, Prague is also a very interesting case. So on the one hand, what we observe is that, as expected, in very large capital city region, we have a higher density of KIBS. I want to draw your attention to another phenomenon, which I think is even more interesting. Well, we have also other cities that are not capital city, but tend to provide a very important value added and employment for KIBS. Look at this. This is Finland, and this is Ireland. Okay? These are two of the lowest contributors of employment in KIBS, well, together with Poland, Latvia, but okay, these are new member states. So let's concentrate on Finland and Ireland. Okay, this might be a bit surprising. We're talking about knowledge-intensive services. Okay, these are regions that have been extremely dynamic in the last 20 years. Okay, this is a picture, but still, if you compare in absolute terms Finland with even with Italy or with Greece, okay, overall Greece has a higher percent, a higher share of KIBS employment as compared to Finland. What do you think lies behind this? Well, are you surprised, first of all, to see that two extremely dynamic regions in terms of growth, in terms of, you know, actually knowledge-intensive economy rank so low in terms of KIBS?
Because they're not big metropolitan areas. They're not as big as the other ones.
Okay, they're not.
In an area which is populated around, because Utrecht is not a big place, but it's in the Netherlands, and there's a lot of population density is high there.
Okay. So there is an issue of population density. And then what else? They are peripheral regions, states in this respect.
They're also small overall. And the population is quite low.
They tend to be small, but this does not account for other cases. Think about the composition, well, what you know in very general terms about the composition of the economy in these countries.
Finland is based a lot on raw materials.
On raw material and on what and on Nokia. Okay, so the idea is that these two regions, and Ireland is very much dense in terms of software companies, as you might know, and in terms of financial services, in relative terms. Now, this structure of the economy is not particularly conducive to have a very large KIBS share of employment and value added. Okay? After all, we've seen and we've mentioned that these companies, first of all, tend to be located in large metropolitan areas, and with the exception of Dublin and Helsinki, but you do not have really big metropolitan areas. Second, you need manufacturing companies in order for these services to be diffused in an economy. Okay? These two types of countries are extremely tertiarized in a way. So the service economy within these two countries is very strong. Okay? Now, having a very strong service economy, which is composed of different kinds of services as with respect to KIBS, means that there is not really space, well, in relative terms, for these KIBS companies as compared to other regions, okay, in which even if you have a very big share of service companies, still you have the manufacturing sector, which is very strong. Okay, Spain, France, where is Germany, and other kind of regions. So, yes?
How would you explain Prague?
Prague is an interesting case because whenever you see statistics about the knowledge-based economy, any kind of indicators you might think of, Prague stands there. It's actually in the top 10 regions in the most recent regional innovation scoreboard, top 10, okay, which accounts for different indicators which have to do with high-tech manufacturing, knowledge-intensive services, lifelong learning processes, human capital, everything. So it seems to be an extremely dynamic region. I do not have yet a clear explanation for the role of Prague, besides the fact that it's in a new member country and it's highly growing, but it's performing very, very well as compared to other very dynamic regions, okay? So the share of KIPs there might have to do with these patterns, but it's an interesting case. It's a metropolitan area, of course, but it's quite striking, actually. So no clear explanation yet. Anyway, so this was a piece of evidence just to convince you that actually what we've mentioned in terms of the spatial dimension is relevant, and of course more investigation would be needed in order to understand what lies behind different patterns. We stop here. Next time, it's November 3rd. I think that on the schedule you should have the external seminar, but that might be shifted on November 10th. Okay, so it's just a change of schedule. Just keep track of that.